Thanks so much for that warm introduction, and it really is a pleasure for me to be here, and I want to thank ANZSOG in particular for the chance to do this for two reasons. The first is it gives me a chance to, I have a US $20 bill here in my pocket. Can I make a deal with anybody for this thing right now? At least I've actually made money while I'm here, because as soon as I arrived, I changed some of these for Australian dollars, and I'm ahead on the deal so far. Who knows what it's going to be like when I get back? But the second point, though, is that I remember a long conversation that I had when I was here on a previous trip about the idea of putting citizens at the center, and that was at the early days of the customer service movement. And the puzzle that we want to try to deal with today is really this somewhat daunting title about whether or not governments are really ready to let go. And the simple answer is no. Are citizens really ready to step up? And the question is maybe. Underlying all of this are issues, though, that are much more important and much more subtle, that have to do with what I think is a fundamental transformation going on right now. Just as was the case about a generation ago, when the customer service movement began to grow, and where there was much more focus and attention on trying to find ways of bringing citizens in, we are, I think, now at just as fundamental a transformation point. And so what I want to do is to break up the points that I want to make into two chunks. First is whether or not we are essentially at the end of a phase of citizen engagement in government. And I mean that in two respects. First, end as in the termination, and the second, what's the purpose of it to begin with? And then the second, maybe some new ideas about how we might be able to go about trying to solve and crack this problem, which I think is as close to a universal phenomenon around the world right now as anything is. And so let me try to start with a couple points. The first is that in terms of citizen empowerment, and in terms of where we've gone, we've really spent about 2 generations betting on a role of citizens in government. One of the enormous breakthroughs and contributions to the new public management was that the idea was that government was too disconnected from citizens and not responsive enough, and that by finding a way to make government more efficient and more responsive, we could somehow unite those two approaches into something that was a really fundamental change in the way in which government ought to operate. And we've now had, depending on how you count, 1, possibly even 2 generations of efforts to try to do that by bringing government closer to the people and letting citizens make choices. And whether or not citizens want to be engaged or not, can be engaged or not, it's hard to escape it, because the 24-hour news cycle has made it impossible for anybody to go anywhere without being connected constantly to what it is that's happening. In my hotel room this morning, I was able to not only watch the Australian views about the craziness going on in the United States, and the basic answer to that, by the way, is that everybody's confident that sooner or later the grown-ups will show up and make the decisions, and the worry increasingly is that there aren't any grown-ups. But I can watch all of this sort of live from Australia, being broadcast back from the United States, and then watching people, as the American stock market was down 2% today, talking about the wisdom of dumping all American stocks and going into cash. These conversations are going on constantly and endlessly, even while people are sleeping in the States trying to figure out what to do here, and vice versa. This connection between citizens and the rest of what it is that's going on is on steroids by comparison to what was the case at the beginning of the new public management. And so it's time now to assess where it is that we are and what it is that's been accomplished from this. And here are sort of 3 quick vignettes that I think are pretty interesting. One, you may recognize in the far left Michelle Bachmann, who is an announced candidate for the presidency of the United States. She is a leader of the Tea Party movement and has said that it's time, she says, for tough love for the American government. My position is clear. I will not raise taxes. I will reduce spending, and I will not vote to raise the debt ceiling. This woman is running for the presidency of the United States and shows one of the difficult reasons why it is that Obama is having such a hard time. There's a hard line on this, and citizens are being stirred up. So the Tea Party idea, as you know, goes way back in American history to the idea of settlers dressing up as American Indians and invading British ships, throwing tea into the harbor in Boston, and using that as a way to try to help spark rebellion as a battle against taxes. The United States is always a little bit strange in these debates because, unlike Australia and New Zealand, we decided 200 years before that we had had enough of the British Crown, and we decided to deal with it by fighting a war. And the Australians and Kiwis in particular have just been much more patient, much more gradual, and still, as a result of that, have maintained some basic confidence in government, which we lost because we distrusted government so much we first fought to get rid of the king, and second, made it impossible for anybody else in American government ever to be king again, which has made it impossible for anybody to do anything. But you see the kind of citizen reaction that's being captured here, because it's not just Michelle Bachmann, but she's really tapping into a very deep reservoir of concern in the United States about just what the government is. So given the topic of the session, will government let go, and what is essentially the citizens' roles are going to be, there are a lot of citizens who have said, enough with the government already. We have had enough. Government is too big. It's time to downsize. It's time to shrink. So the question of engaging citizens in the government is not only a matter of engaging citizens about how to make government work better, but also the question about what it is that government ought to do. We're in the middle of one of those really critical tipping points where that question's on the stand, not just in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. Here's a quote from The Economist from just a couple months ago. The Economist wrote, "Australians must now decide what sort of country they want their children to live in." There's a kind of fundamental debate here about not only the size of the government, what it is that the government ought to be. And New Zealand, I couldn't resist this. Just a few weeks ago, this is question time. A speaker says, "I worry it is turning into a contest to see who can make the most noise. Question time is not about that." And then when upon he was interrupted again in the effort to try to have a conversation. That sounds very American in terms of those kinds of issues and conversations, and we don't have question time. Probably a good thing for everybody at this point, given the tensions in Washington that we don't. But it's hard looking at this to escape the sense that this question about the connection between citizens and government is now about much, much, much more than co-production, and much, much, much more than the matter of trying to improve efficiency and effectiveness, and is increasingly the question about who we are and what we want to be and how we're going to make that happen. So this is not in any way to suggest that co-production isn't important because it's huge, or that responsiveness to citizens and service delivery isn't important, because it is. But there's also something very fundamental going on that has to do with, in a sense, redefining what the role of government is in a way that I think is just as fundamental as it was at the beginning of the new public management. We've had, depending on how you count, this generation or two, and what kind of results can we point to be sure, vast improvements in the efficiency of government around the world because of these reforms. But it's hard to escape the sense that, as Rolf pointed out in particular, we have decline in support for public institutions, and I'll show you some scary statistics from the United States in just a moment. The issue of fiscal stress, which is not only the economic collapse that came after the problems with Lehman Brothers and others, but the sense that we're going to be in tight fiscal constraints for a very long time. The idea of going back to normal, as many people hoped in late 2008, seems to be just a pipe dream. In the United States, there's this phrase about the new normal, the idea of fiscal constraints now being the inescapable imperative of our age, and that is part of what it is that's driving the sense of what it is we want government to do. That's leading to calls for radical reshaping of the public sector. The big debate in the United States has now been not how much in the way of taxes you can try to raise to fill in the gap, but what services you're going to cut to bring the deficit down. Democrats are now talking about cuts, and they put forward a plan that actually cut the government more than the Republicans did in Washington. We're talking about a radical reshaping of what it is that government does in a way that also simultaneously holds out demands for better performance, because at least in the United States, we're in this really peculiar situation where people don't seem to like government much. They sure don't trust government very much, but every problem that emerges quickly becomes a public problem. We were talking yesterday in a panel discussion about the BP oil spill, and one of the things that happened in the Gulf of Mexico was we had an oil rig owned by BP that blew up. And first of all, this was not in American waters per se, out in the middle of the Gulf. Secondly, it was a failure of a private company. Third, it created oil that was generated by the failure of the private company that endangered America's beaches. And immediately the question is, when is the government going to step in and try to get this problem solved? We have actually a pretty clear policy. We tend to frown upon oil wells blowing up and spilling oil across our beaches. And it was a failure of a private company that produced the problem. But it became instantly a public problem that demanded a public solution. So whatever it is that citizens expect from government, it's less government, get government off our backs, fewer taxes, cut government spending, cut the rascals, throw the rascals out. But by the way, when a problem comes up, we expect pretty nearly instant response from government. And if it happens or doesn't happen, it's there 24 hours a day on CNN for everybody to watch across the world. That's a different kind of game than was the case when I was here 15 years ago having a discussion about citizen-centered government. Here's a chart on the trust in government problem in the United States in particular. I think the technical explanation is not a happy story. If you look back over this, we had a time back in the Kennedy administration, back in 1960, where trust in government was pretty high, but where it fell and fell and fell, largely because of Vietnam, but finally hit a low point in 1980. Ronald Reagan began to build things back up again, but that began to collapse again in the 1990s. During the Clinton administration, it came back up again, and then in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks and then the continuing gridlock that we've had in Washington, we've had a decline in trust and confidence. And the headlines now out of Washington are that people really don't much like or trust Obama, but they dislike and trust the Republicans more. And so we've got a situation where, in other places they talk about hung parliaments. There are a lot of people who would like to hang ours. But the problem is that at this point, there's just nobody in charge. We've created a system of government that requires everybody to work together, and nobody wants to work on anything. Why? Because they're nasty people? I don't think so. I've met John Boehner. I've had a chance to watch the president. They're good people. They just have different ideas, and there is no room for compromise. And it's not just brinksmanship to the edge, because I think at the deep bottom of all of this is a kind of intuitive sense that we're really talking about some very fundamental changes about what government is and what citizens' relationship to that government will be. So what we're watching as you watch this horrible drama in Washington is not just politics simply gone amok, but a fundamental debate on values about what government is and what citizens' expectations are and should be. On top of that, first of all, as Rolf suggested, the trust problem is not just an American one, although I think we've perfected the art of distrust of government in a way that the rest of the world can only envy. But the problem of fiscal stress is totally universal. If you look at this, here's some figures that have been produced by the International Monetary Fund, and here's a measure of fiscal stress among developed countries. Very interesting, and what we've seen here is that we've had for the last, especially since my last visit to Australia, a state where things were not sort of terrible, not especially great, but with the financial crisis that occurred in 2008, we've had a massive increase in fiscal stress on governments, not only in the United States, but around the world, which is part of this process of trying to figure out what it is we want government to be. So we've got some pretty fundamental and pretty big issues that we need to struggle with. What we've had are a series of reforms that have been in an effort to try to sort this out, and it's really been built on a kind of theory that the things we want government to do, we assign responsibility to agencies to produce those results. We put leaders in charge and hold them accountable for their outputs and ultimately for the outcomes. So we've been spending the last 20 years roughly trying to put boxes around problems and trying to make those boxes work more effectively, and now increasingly connecting those boxes more with citizens and connecting the boxes with other boxes trying to deal with other kinds of issues. But we've really had an idea that's driven this. And what I want to suggest in the time that we've got is that we've got some really difficult problems. Because in the Westminster approach to these government reforms that have really been focused on making the managers manage, creating some tough rules, tough incentives to try to ensure accountability, that what we have is the increasing realization that these agencies need to work with each other. And so it's a matter of question of connecting with citizens is in part how to prevent